There was a decade when American design stopped being merely elegant and started becoming unforgettable. In the early 1970s, something changed in Detroit. The lines became wider, the stances more aggressive, and for the first time, many cars achieved something very difficult, combining brutal presence with real beauty. But here's the interesting question. Because today, when people talk about the 1970s, the conversation almost always goes to the same place. The most famous muscle cars, the most repeated names, the usual suspects. But what if some of the most beautiful American cars of the 1970s weren't exactly the ones everyone mentions first? Get ready, because what comes next proves why the 1970s were one of the most visually powerful eras in American automotive history. Let's begin. 1970 Dodge Challenger RT. If there was a car in the 1970s that understood how to combine aggression and beauty at first glance, it was this one. When the Challenger arrived in 1970, Dodge wasn't trying to be discreet. It wasn't chasing European refinement or quiet luxury either. The objective was much clearer: create a coupe that looked powerful even when standing completely still. And it succeeded. Visually, it remains one of the best proportioned designs of the entire muscle car era. The body is wide, low, and perfectly planted on the pavement. The long hood, rear-set cabin, and clean lines create a silhouette that communicates constant tension without falling into the chaotic excess that would appear later in the decade. It doesn't look forced, it looks natural and dangerous. The front end, with its darkened grille and wide stance, reinforces the feeling of a serious machine. It doesn't try to be elegant in the traditional sense. Its beauty comes precisely from that blend of muscular simplicity and very well-resolved proportions. Inside, the environment followed the same philosophy. Bucket seats, clear instrumentation, and a driving position that made it obvious this car was built for more than casual cruising. And when its full potential was unleashed, the reputation made perfect sense. In its most representative configuration, could be equipped with the massive 440 Magnum 5.8 producing around 375 horsepower. A very serious figure for 1970, and enough to make this coupe a dominant presence both in a straight line and in the public imagination. And that's the key to its appeal even today. It wasn't the most luxurious, it wasn't the most discreet, but it was one of the most visually balanced muscle cars of the entire decade. Today, a well-preserved 1970 Dodge Challenger typically ranges between $90,000 and $160,000, with exceptional examples far exceeding that. And what's interesting is, this only sets the tone for what the 1970s were about to deliver. 1976, Cadillac Eldorado. After the pure tension of the Challenger, the tone changes completely. Because if the Dodge represented 1970s aggression, the Eldorado embodied something very different. Absolute presence with zero intention of apologizing for its size. By the mid-decade, Cadillac fully understood its audience. Not everyone wanted to out-accelerate the car next to them. Many buyers wanted something else. Something that dominated the road through sheer visual authority. And this Eldorado did exactly that, effortlessly. Visually, it's impossible to ignore. The body is long, wide, and extremely low for a coupe of its size. The lines are clean but imposing, and the extended front fenders create that unmistakable silhouette that turned the Eldorado into one of the great symbols of 1970s American luxury. It doesn't try to look agile, it tries to look important, and it succeeds from every angle. Inside, the approach was exactly what you would expect from Cadillac in this era. Outstanding isolation, generously sized seating, and an atmosphere designed for gliding down the highway with almost floating calm. This wasn't a car built for hurry, it was built for presence. But that doesn't mean it lacked muscle. In 1976, the Eldorado carried the massive 500 cubic inch V8 producing around 190 horsepower during the height of emissions restrictions. The number may look modest compared to early muscle cars, but the character of the car never depended on explosive figures. It depended on how it felt on the road, smooth, commanding, and deeply American. In terms of production, Cadillac built approximately 35,000 Eldorados in 1976. It wasn't ultra-rare when new, but over time, truly well-preserved examples have become increasingly appreciated by collectors. It wasn't light, It wasn't discreet, but it represented American luxury in its most self-assured form. Today, a well-kept 1976 Cadillac Eldorado typically ranges between $25,000 and $50,000, with exceptional examples exceeding that range. A 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS. And this is where the conversation gets much more serious. Because if up to this point we've seen cars that were balanced, elegant, or aggressive, the 1970 Chevelle enters with a very different mission: demand immediate respect. At the start of the decade, Chevrolet knew exactly what buyers wanted. It was no longer enough to simply look good. A car had to communicate strength before the key even turned. And this one does it at first glance. Visually, it's one of the best proportioned muscle cars of the entire classic era. The body is muscular but clean. The front end is firm, without unnecessary decoration. And the stance on the pavement sends a clear message of contained power. There's no gratuitous exaggeration here. Everything in its design communicates one word: intention. The 1970 Chevelle represents that perfect moment when American muscle still carried a certain elegance in its lines, just before excess began to dominate the decade. Inside, the atmosphere makes it clear this isn't just a cruiser. The driving position feels direct, the instrumentation is driver-focused, and the overall setup invites something very different from simply gliding down the highway. It invites you to press the throttle, and when the SS454 revealed what it carried under the hood, the reputation was fully justified. In its most iconic configuration, it packed the legendary 454 cubic inch LS 6V8, officially rated at 450 gross horsepower. In 1970, that figure placed it squarely among the most feared muscle cars on American streets. The delivery was brutal, immediate, and deeply dominant for its time. In terms of production, Chevrolet built just over 4,400 LS, 6 equipped Chevelle, in 1970, which today makes these versions some of the most sought after by serious collectors. That's the reason for its legend. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't discreet, it was American muscle in its purest form. Today, a well-preserved 1970 Chevelle SS typically ranges between $90,000 and $160,000, with authentic LS. 6 examples far exceeding that. Now, I want your opinion. Between the elegance of the Eldorado and the brutality of the SS454, which one would sit in your ideal 1970s garage? Tell me in the comments, because what comes next shifts the tone of this list completely. 1971. Buick Riviera. And now the tone turns again, but not toward muscle, toward something far more visually daring. Because if there's a 1970s car that divided opinions from day one, it was this Riviera. Not because it lacked presence, but because Buick decided to do something very few manufacturers dared during the muscle era: take a real design risk. When it arrived in 1971, the Riviera abandoned the more conservative shapes of the previous decade and introduced a silhouette that is still instantly recognizable today. The famous boat-tail rear end looked like nothing else on American roads. Visually, it's impossible to confuse it with anything else. The body is long, low, and flowing, but what truly defines the car is that sharply tapered rear section, almost sculptural, giving it a unique profile from every angle. It's one of those designs that doesn't try to please everyone, and precisely because of that, it has aged remarkably well. This Buick wasn't trying to be discreet, it was trying to be memorable, and it succeeded. Inside, the focus remained clearly premium: wide seating, quality materials, and that early 1970s Buick character: serious comfort, strong isolation, and a personality built for devouring miles and calm confidence. But beneath that unconventional elegance, there was enough muscle to support the image. In 1971, the Riviera carried the powerful 455 cubic inch V8, producing around 315 horsepower in the early versions. It wasn't a pure muscle car, but it had more than respectable thrust for a large personal luxury coupe. Buick produced approximately 33,800 Rivieras in 1971. It wasn't ultra-rare at the time, but today well-preserved first-year boat-tail models are increasingly appreciated by collectors and design enthusiasts alike. That's its modern magic, It wasn't conventional. It wasn't shy. It was American design taking real risks. Today, a well-kept 1971 Buick Riviera Boattail typically ranges between $25,000 and $55,000, with exceptional examples exceeding that. And as we move forward, the decade still holds some very interesting surprises. 1973, Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. And now we return to territory where the intention is no longer disguised. Because if the Riviera played with bold elegance, the 1973 Trans Am brings back one of the key words of the decade: attitude. By the early 1970s, Pontiac knew exactly what it was doing with the Firebird lineup. The goal wasn't to create a delicate or refined coupe. It was to build something that looked fast even when parked. And this version makes that clear instantly. Visually, it's pure, well-planted muscle. The low front end, split grille, and, most importantly, the iconic shaker hood scoop create an aggressive yet still clean presence by the standards of the time. The body lines maintain tension without unnecessary excess, and the overall stance suggests constant motion. This Pontiac doesn't try to look elegant. It tries to look ready to attack the road, and it succeeds easily. When it revealed what was under the hood, the reputation wasn't accidental. In 1973, the most desirable versions carried the famous Super Duty 455 V8, officially rated around 290 net horsepower, but with real-world performance that remained highly respectable in the post-peak muscle era. It was a car that still pushed with authority when many rivals were already losing character. Pontiac built just over 4,800 Trans Ams in 1973, and the Super Duty variants were extremely limited, which today makes them highly prized collector pieces. That's the reason for its current status. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't soft. It was one of the last strong statements of character before the decade changed completely. Today, a well-preserved 1973 Trans Am typically ranges between $45,000 and $90,000, while rare Super Duty examples can far exceed those numbers. 1972, Oldsmobile Cutlass 442. And this is where the aggression begins to mature, because while the Trans Am represented raw, unfiltered muscle, the Cutlass 442 plays a far more interesting game: serious performance wrapped in elegance. By the early 1970s, Oldsmobile already understood that not every buyer wanted a muscle car that shouted from every angle. Some wanted speed, yes, but with a cleaner, more mature, more controlled presence. And this model fit that space perfectly. Visually, the 442 maintains very balanced proportions: long hood, clean side profile, and a low stance that communicates intent without excess. It's not the most aggressive muscle car of the decade, but that's precisely why it has aged so well. This Oldsmobile feels solid, cohesive, and surprisingly elegant for a car with this level of performance. It's the kind of design that doesn't need giant stripes or exaggerated scoops to make it clear there's something serious under the hood. Inside, the philosophy continues. The cabin is comfortable, well-finished, and clearly more refined than many direct rivals. There's still muscle here, but also a mechanical maturity many buyers appreciated. And when it was time to deliver, the 442 did not disappoint. In 1972, one of the most representative configurations featured the 455 cubic inch V8, producing around 270 net horsepower. The number may look more restrained than in earlier years, but in practice it still delivered strong, highly usable thrust on the open road. Oldsmobile produced approximately 11,000 units of the 442 in 1972, which today keeps it relatively accessible, but increasingly valued by those who understand this transition phase of American muscle. Today, a well-preserved 1972 Cutlass 442 typically ranges between $45,000 and $80,000, with especially clean examples climbing steadily in the market. Now, I want your opinion. Between the aggression of the Trans Am and the muscular elegance of the 442, which one would you choose? Tell me in the comments, because what comes next raises the intensity of this list once again. 1970 Ford Mustang Mach 1. And this is where the list truly lights up again, because if there's one name capable of instantly grabbing any enthusiast's attention, It's Mustang. But the 1970 Mach 1 wasn't just another trim level. It was the most serious, most mature, and most aggressive interpretation of the American pony car at the peak of its confidence. By the early 1970s, Ford knew the Mustang had to evolve. The market had become more demanding, more competitive, and this model responds perfectly to that pressure. Visually, the Mach 1 is pure, controlled tension. The deep front fascia with dual headlights, the darkened grille, and the long hood with scoop create a much more muscular presence than early Mustangs. The fastback roofline flows naturally into the rear, giving the car a silhouette that looks fast even when standing still. This is not a delicate design. It doesn't try to be. This Mustang speaks the full language of the 1970s, wider, lower, and far more self-assured. And when the Mach 1 revealed what it carried under the hood, the reputation was no accident. In 1970, one of the most desirable configurations featured the powerful 428 Cobra Jet V8, producing around 335 gross horsepower. In real-world driving, the thrust was especially strong in mid-range acceleration, where this Mustang felt genuinely alive for its size. Ford produced approximately 40,900 Mach 1 units in 1970, which keeps it accessible in the classic market, but increasingly valued for its balance of design and character. That's the key to its appeal today. It wasn't the most extreme Mustang, it wasn't the rarest, but it was one of the cars that best captured the full spirit of American muscle at the start of the 1970s. Today, a well-preserved 1970 Mach 1 typically ranges between $55,000 and $95,000, with especially well-documented examples rising strongly in value. And what comes next takes us to a muscle car that chose a far more refined path. 1971, Dodge Charger SE. And now the tone shifts again, but in a much more sophisticated way. Because while the Mustang Mach 1 represented direct, youthful muscle, the Charger SE enters the scene with a different proposal. Powerful presence, wrapped in refinement. By the early 1970s, Dodge already understood that not every buyer wanted the same kind of aggression. Some still wanted character, yes, but with a more mature, more elegant image, something closer to an American Grand Tourer, and the SE fit that role perfectly. Visually, it moves away from the raw tension of the late 60s models and adopts more fluid, sophisticated lines. The body is long and low. The front end still carries character, but the overall feel is more polished, more grown up. It doesn't try to intimidate like the '69 RT. It imposes calmly. The fastback silhouette remains, but now it flows more smoothly into the rear, creating a profile many enthusiasts today consider one of the most elegant of the entire Charger generation. Inside, the shift is even more obvious. The SE Special Edition trim clearly elevated the cabin, more isolation, better materials, and an atmosphere much closer to a luxury coupe than a traditional muscle car. This was a car for someone who wanted power, but also real comfort on the highway. And when it was time to perform, this Dodge didn't fall short. In 1971, it could be equipped with several serious V8 options, but one of the most representative setups featured the 383 Magnum, producing around 300 gross horsepower. Delivery was strong, progressive, and perfectly aligned with the model's more refined character. Dodge built tens of thousands of Chargers in 1971, but well-equipped SE versions are the ones drawing the most attention today from collectors looking for something beyond the typical aggressive muscle car. Today, a well-preserved 1971 Charger SE typically ranges between $40,000 and $75,000, with especially well-maintained examples steadily gaining value in recent years. 1977 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. And this is where pop culture steps in at full force. Because if the Charger represented refined muscle, the Trans Am arrived with something even more powerful than raw numbers: iconic presence. This wasn't just a beautiful car from the 1970s. It was a cultural phenomenon that helped define an entire generation. By the late decade, when many muscle cars had already lost part of their edge, Pontiac made a smart move with the Firebird. Instead of trying to recreate the past, it amplified visual personality. The result was one of the most recognizable designs of the entire era. Visually, it's pure spectacle, executed properly. The low, aggressive front end, flared fenders, and the massive screaming chicken on the hood create a silhouette that can't be confused with anything else on the road. It's more theatrical than the 1973 model, yes, but also far more aware of its visual impact. This Pontiac doesn't try to be discreet. It wants to be seen. And even today, it succeeds. Inside, the atmosphere balances sportiness and comfort in that late 1970s way. The driving position remains low and focused, but the car feels more usable day to day than the raw early-decade muscle machines. It was performance, but also lifestyle. And even though the golden age of brute horsepower had passed, the Trans Am still had something to say under the hood. In 1977, one of the best-known configurations featured the 6.6-liter V8, producing around 200 net horsepower. It wasn't the brutality of the early 1970s, but it was enough to preserve the character buyers expected. Pontiac built more than 68,000 Trans Ams in 1977, fueled largely by its enormous cultural and media impact. Today, well-preserved examples, especially those tied to the most iconic visual packages, continue to see strong demand. That's the secret to its staying power. It wasn't the fastest of the decade, it wasn't the rarest, but it was one of the most unforgettable. Today, a 1977 Trans Am in good condition typically ranges between $35,000 and $70,000, with especially original examples exceeding that range. And now, we approach the end of this journey with one of the most brutally proportioned silhouettes of the entire muscle era. 1970 Plymouth Barracuda. And this is where the conversation gets serious again. Because if the Eldorado represented luxury without urgency, the Cuda was born with a completely different mission. Look dangerous, even when standing still. At the start of the 1970s, Plymouth understood that younger buyers didn't just want horsepower. They wanted attitude. They wanted compact proportions, aggressive stance, and a car that projected character from the first glance. And this model delivered exactly that. Visually, it's one of the best resolved muscle designs of the entire decade. The body is short, wide, and firmly planted on the pavement. The long hood, rear-set cabin, and pronounced wheel arches create a tense, muscular, and instantly recognizable silhouette. There's no decorative excess. Everything is focused on conveying contained energy. This car doesn't try to look elegant. It tries to look fast, and it does so with brutal naturalness. Inside, the atmosphere moves far away from the floating luxury we saw in the Cadillac. Everything here is more direct, more driver-focused. The seating position feels firm, the instrumentation is clear, and the overall sensation invites one simple thing: real driving. And when the Cuda revealed what it carried under the hood, the reputation was fully justified. In its most representative versions, it could be equipped with the famous 440 six-barrel, or even the legendary 426 Hemi, producing well over 390 horsepower. In a car of this size, that made it genuinely intimidating for its time. The 1970 Barracuda was built in relatively moderate volumes by Detroit standards, and high-performance versions, especially Hemi cars, are now extremely coveted by collectors. Today, a well-preserved 1970 Plymouth Cuda typically ranges from $70,000 to well over $200,000, depending on engine and originality, with Hemi examples in an entirely different league. And after looking at all these machines, one thing becomes very clear. The 1970s didn't have just one definition of American beauty. Sometimes it was pure, wide, aggressive muscle. Other times it was dominant, silent luxury filled with presence. And in many cases, it was the perfect blend of character, proportion, and attitude on the pavement. Now I want your opinion of all the cars we saw today. Which one best represents true American beauty of the 1970s for you? Tell me in the comments, because your choice says a lot about how each of us understands this golden era. And if this journey made you see the 1970s differently, don't miss the video on your screen right now, where we explore the rarest American cars of the 1970s, forgotten machines, limited production models, and stories very few people know today. Click, continue the journey, and I'll see you in the next video.